The harsh crack of a gunshot echoed through the Montana wilderness as Hazel Greene sprinted toward the lone oak tree, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was supposed to be a simple transaction: deliver the medicine to the mining camp and return to Silverpine with payment. Nobody mentioned the territorial dispute or the armed men who'd chase a woman for daring to cross their land. Clutching the leather satchel to her chest, Hazel ducked behind the massive trunk, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The year 1878 had already taken everything from her father, their general store in Cincinnati, and her carefully constructed future. Now the Montana Territory seemed determined to take her life as well. "Miss, over here." The voice startled her, low and urgent. Through the settling dust, she spotted a man on horseback at the edge of the tree line, his face shadowed beneath a worn Stetson. He extended his hand toward her, the reins of a second horse clutched in his other grip. "Unless you're partial to catching lead, I suggest you come with me." Hazel hesitated only a moment before another bullet splintered bark inches from her head. She sprinted toward the stranger, her skirts bunched in one hand. As she reached him, he leaned down, strong arms hoisting her effortlessly onto the spare mount. "Hold tight," he instructed, and then they were galloping through the trees, away from the shouts and gunfire. The wind whipped at Hazel's auburn hair as they rode, her pins long lost to the chase. The stranger rode ahead, leading them through a maze of pine and aspen that she'd never be able to retrace. Only when the sounds of pursuit had faded completely did he slow their pace, guiding them toward what appeared to be a narrow game trail. "We'll be safe at my place," he said over his shoulder. "It's not far now." "Who were those men?" Hazel called, still clutching the medicine satchel. "Russell's boys. They've been trying to run everyone off this stretch of land since they found traces of silver. And you are." He turned slightly, and for the first time she caught a glimpse of his face weathered by sun and wind, but younger than she'd expected, perhaps no more than 30. His eyes, clear blue beneath the brim of his hat, assessed her with equal curiosity. Finnian Cooper." "Most folks just call me Finn." "Hazel Greene. I'm the new doctor's assistant from back east," he finished for her. "Word travels fast in these parts, especially when it's a lady doing a man's job." Before she could form an indignant response, they emerged from the trees into a small clearing. A modest cabin stood at its center, smoke curling from the stone chimney. A covered porch wrapped around the front, and beyond it, a small barn and corral where several horses grazed peacefully. "Welcome to Cooper's Creek," Finn said, dismounting in one fluid motion. He moved to help her down, strong hands spanning her waist as he lifted her from the saddle. The contact was brief but unsettling, and Hazel quickly stepped away, smoothing her rumpled skirts. "I appreciate your help, Mr. Cooper, but I need to return to Silverpine. Doctor Matthews will be expecting these supplies." "Not tonight, you won't," Finn replied, leading both horses toward the barn. "Russell's men will be watching the main trails. You can head back at first light. I'll show you a safe route." As if to emphasize his point, the distant rumble of thunder rolled across the mountains. Dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, the late afternoon light fading rapidly. "I can't impose," Hazel protested, though the prospect of navigating unfamiliar terrain in a storm was daunting. Finn secured the horses and returned to where she stood, uncertainty written across her features. "It's no imposition. I've got stew on the stove and a spare room that my sister uses when she visits from Helena." The mention of a sister eased some of Hazel's apprehension. Perhaps this rugged stranger wasn't as dangerous as the men she'd fled. "Just until dawn," she conceded, following him toward the cabin as the first fat raindrops began to fall. Inside, the cabin was surprisingly welcoming. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its flames casting warm light across simple but well-crafted furniture. Bookshelves lined another wall, filled with volumes that seemed at odds with Finn's frontier appearance. "Make yourself comfortable," he said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. Without the shadow of its brim, his features were more defined: a straight nose, strong jaw covered in a day's stubble, and those startlingly blue eyes that seemed to notice everything. He moved to the cast iron stove where a pot simmered, lifting the lid to stir its contents. The rich aroma of beef and vegetables filled the cabin, reminding Hazel that she hadn't eaten since breakfast. "You read Emerson?" she asked, noticing a familiar spine among his collection. Finn glanced over, a hint of surprise crossing his features. "I do." "Not what you expected from a Montana cowboy." "I'm learning not to expect anything in this territory," she replied, setting her satchel carefully on a nearby chair. "Everything I thought I knew seems to be wrong out here." He ladled stew into 2 bowls and placed them on a simple wooden table. "Including your ideas about which trails are safe to travel alone." Hazel accepted the bowl he offered, along with a chunk of fresh bread. "Especially that. Dr. Matthews said the northern route was clear. It was, until last week." Finn sat across from her, breaking his bread. "Russell brought in more men from Butte. They're getting desperate to drive out the smaller claims before winter." As they ate, Finn explained the complex web of land disputes that had been brewing in the valley for the past year. Hazel found herself both alarmed and fascinated by the politics of this untamed place so different from the ordered streets of Cincinnati. "Is that why you saved me?" she asked as they finished their meal. Despite these Russell men, Finn's expression sobered. "I saved you because they would have killed you without a second thought, and then claimed you were trespassing. No one deserves that fate, especially not someone trying to bring medicine to folks who need it." The simple honesty in his words touched something in Hazel. Since arriving in Montana 3 weeks ago, she'd encountered plenty of men who viewed her with suspicion or derision for stepping outside traditional women's roles. Finnian Cooper seemed different. As the evening progressed, rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled through the pines. Finn added logs to the fire and brought out a checkerboard. To Hazel's surprise, the hours passed easily in his company, their conversation flowing from books to medicine to the challenges of frontier life. How does a woman trained in medicine end up in Silverpine? He asked as she captured another of his pieces. Hazel hesitated, the familiar weight of grief pressing against her chest. "My father died last winter, influenza. I nursed him through it, but..." She shook her head. "After he was gone, I discovered the store was deeply in debt. There was nothing left." "I'm sorry," Finn said quietly. "An advertisement in the Cincinnati paper caught my eye. Dr. Matthews seeking an assistant with medical knowledge. My father taught me herbalism, and I'd helped in his store since I was a girl. It seemed providential." "And is it what you hoped?" Hazel considered the question. "It's harder than I imagined. The work is demanding, the conditions primitive compared to what I knew, but there's purpose here, people who truly need help." Finn nodded, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "Purpose is what keeps most of us in these mountains, despite the hardships." "And what's your purpose, Mr. Cooper?" she asked, curious about this solitary man with his books and his isolated cabin. A shadow crossed his features. "Once upon a time it was gold. Now." He gestured to the window, where beyond the rain-streaked glass lay his small homestead. "Now it's this land, making something honest from it." There was more to his story, Hazel sensed, but she didn't press. Everyone in this territory seemed to be running from something or towards something, often both at once. Later, he showed her to a small but tidy bedroom. "My sister's room," he explained, lighting a lamp on the simple dresser. "There are extra blankets in the chest if you get cold." "Thank you," Hazel said, suddenly aware of how inappropriate this situation might appear to others. A single woman spending the night in a bachelor's home would cause scandal in Cincinnati. As if reading her thoughts, Finn stepped back into the hallway. "I'll be in the main room if you need anything. We should leave at first light to get you back to town safely." After he'd gone, Hazel sat on the edge of the narrow bed, listening to the rain drumming on the roof. Despite the circumstances, she felt strangely secure in this stranger's home, far from the town she'd barely begun to know. Perhaps it was exhaustion or the lingering warmth of the hearth fire, but sleep came quickly and deeply. She dreamed of gunshots and galloping horses, of her father's store in flames, and of blue eyes watching her from the shadows. Dawn broke with mist rising from the damp earth, the storm having passed in the night. Hazel woke to the smell of coffee and the quiet sounds of movement in the cabin. She dressed quickly, pinning her hair as neatly as possible without her usual toiletries. In the main room, Finn stood at the stove, frying bacon and eggs in a cast iron skillet. He'd already been outside, his boots were damp, and his hair slightly wet where it curled at his collar. "Morning," he said, glancing up as she entered. "Thought you might want something hot before we ride." "Thank you." Hazel accepted the mug of coffee he offered. "Is it safe to return now?" "Should be. Russell's men won't patrol in broad daylight, too many witnesses, and I know paths they don't." They ate quickly, the easy conversation of the previous evening replaced by practical planning. Finn explained the route they would take, avoiding the main trails while keeping to solid ground that wouldn't leave obvious tracks. As Hazel gathered her things, she felt a curious reluctance to leave this cabin and its owner. In the clear light of morning, she could better appreciate the care that had gone into building this place, the precise joinery of the furniture, the neat stitching on the curtains, the way everything had its proper place. "You've made a real home here," she observed as Finn saddled the horses. He paused, hands stilling on the leather strap. "Tried to. It's still missing some things that make a true home." The words hung between them, laden with meaning Hazel wasn't sure how to interpret. Before she could respond, he tightened the final strap and handed her the reins. "We should get moving. It's about 2 hours to town if we keep a steady pace." The morning was cool and bright as they rode through forest and meadow, climbing ridges only to descend into sheltered valleys. Finn led the way, occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing bits of local knowledge, which berries were safe to eat, which tracks belonged to which animals, how to find north when clouds obscured the sun. "You know this land intimately," Hazel remarked as they paused to rest the horses beside a small stream. "5 years I've been here," Finn replied, scanning the horizon with practiced eyes. "A man either learns the land or the land kills him, a harsh teacher, but fair." He offered her his canteen. "The mountains don't care who you were before, only what you're willing to become." Hazel drank, considering his words. "Is that why you came here, to become someone new?" Finn reclaimed the canteen, his fingers brushing hers briefly. "Isn't that why most people head west?" They continued their journey, and Hazel found herself mentally cataloging everything about this man: the straight set of his shoulders, the ease with which he handled his horse, the way sunlight caught in his light brown hair when he removed his hat to wipe his brow. By mid-morning they crested a final ridge, and the town of Silverpine spread below them, a collection of wooden buildings nestled in a valley, with the larger structures of the sawmill and mining office dominating one end. "There you are," Finn said, reining his horse to a stop. Safe and sound, as promised. Hazel felt a pang of disappointment that their journey was ending. "I don't know how to thank you properly, Mr. Cooper." "Finn," he corrected gently, "and staying alive is thanks enough." As they descended toward town, Hazel became increasingly aware of what her appearance might suggest returning after a night away, escorted by a man unknown in Silverpine. The town was small, and gossip traveled faster than telegrams. "Perhaps you should let me ride in alone," she suggested as they approached the outskirts. Finn frowned. "Those men are still out there. But my reputation is worth less than your life," he finished firmly. "Besides, you have a perfectly reasonable explanation. You were caught in the storm while delivering medicine and found shelter." "With a strange man," Hazel pointed out. "With a respectable rancher," Finn countered, though a smile tugged at his lips. "Though I won't claim to be much of a gentleman." Despite her concerns, Hazel was secretly relieved to have him beside her as they rode down the main street. Several townspeople stopped to stare, and she held her head high, refusing to appear ashamed. They reached the doctor's office, a whitewashed building with a small sign announcing Dr. James Matthews, physician and surgeon. Finn dismounted and helped Hazel down, his hands lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary at her waist. "Will you be all right?" "Of course," she said, retrieving her satchel. "Dr. Matthews will be concerned but relieved once I explain." As if summoned by his name, the door opened, and an older man with spectacles and a gray beard emerged onto the porch. "Miss Greene, thank heavens." His relief quickly transformed to scrutiny as he noted her companion. "And who might this be?" "Dr. Matthews, this is Mr. Finnian Cooper. He saved me from some very unpleasant men on the Northern Trail and offered shelter during the storm." The doctor's eyebrows rose slightly, but he extended his hand. "Then I owe you my thanks, Mr. Cooper. My assistant is invaluable to my practice." Finn shook the offered hand. "She's brave to do the work she does." "Foolhardy, some might say," Matthews replied with a pointed look at Hazel, "but we'll discuss that later. Come inside, my dear, you must be exhausted." Hazel turned to Finn, suddenly reluctant to say goodbye. "Thank you again for everything." "My pleasure, Miss Greene." He tipped his hat, those blue eyes holding hers for a moment. "Perhaps our paths will cross again." "Perhaps they will," she replied, hoping the warmth in her cheeks wasn't visible to the doctor standing beside her. Finn mounted his horse and with a final nod rode away, his figure growing smaller as he headed back toward the trail they'd descended. "Well," Dr. Matthews said once Finn was out of earshot, "you've had quite an adventure. Come inside and tell me everything after you've freshened up, of course." Hazel followed him into the office, aware that her ordeal had only postponed the inevitable lecture about proper routes and the dangers facing a woman alone in the territory. Yet as she washed her face in the basin and smoothed her rumpled clothing, her thoughts remained with the solitary cabin in the mountains and its enigmatic owner. Over the following weeks, Hazel threw herself into her work with renewed purpose. The incident with Russell's men had demonstrated just how precarious life in the territory could be, and the need for medical care was constant. Mining accidents, childbirth, fevers, injuries from falls and fights, the stream of patients never ceased. Dr. Matthews, for all his initial skepticism about employing a female assistant, had come to rely heavily on Hazel's calm efficiency and knowledge of herbal remedies, which often proved more effective than his conventional medicines for certain ailments. "You have a gift," he told her one evening as they finished bandaging a miner's crushed hand. "The patients trust you." "They trust you," Hazel corrected, washing blood from her hands in the basin. "I'm just the woman who brings them tea and changes their dressings." Matthews shook his head, removing his spectacles to clean them on his handkerchief. "No, it's more than that. You listen to them. Really listen. That's half of healing in my experience." Hazel accepted the compliment with a small smile, though her thoughts drifted briefly to another who had truly listened to her, Finn Cooper, whose face still appeared in her dreams more often than she cared to admit. "Oh, I nearly forgot," Matthews continued, returning his glasses to his nose. "Mrs. Watkins asked if you might join their sewing circle tomorrow evening. Apparently, they're quite desperate for new blood." Hazel stifled a sigh. Since arriving in Silverpine, she'd received numerous such invitations, attempts by the local women to incorporate her into their social circles. While she appreciated their efforts, these gatherings inevitably devolved into marriage discussions and gentle probing about her past and future intentions. "I'll consider it," she said diplomatically, though she had little interest in spending hours discussing the merits of various stitches or eligible bachelors. The next day brought unexpected excitement to Silverpine. A cattle drive was passing near the town, and several of the drovers had ridden in for supplies and entertainment. The saloon was doing brisk business, and the general store had set out extra merchandise to tempt the visitors. Hazel was returning from delivering medicine to the widow Simmons when she heard a familiar voice from the direction of the livery stable. "Best price you'll find this side of Helena." She paused, her heart quickening at the sound. Through the open doors of the stable, she could see Finn Cooper in conversation with the blacksmith, gesturing toward several horses in the corral behind them. Without conscious decision, Hazel found herself changing course, drawn toward the stable as if by an invisible thread. As she approached, Finn glanced up, his sentence trailing off mid-word as he recognized her. "Miss Greene," he said, removing his hat in a gesture that seemed more genuine than merely polite. "What a pleasant surprise." "Mr. Cooper," she replied, suddenly conscious of her plain work dress and practical boots. "I didn't expect to see you in town." The blacksmith, sensing the current between them, mumbled something about checking his forge and retreated into the shadowed interior of the stable. "Brought some horses to sell," Finn explained, gesturing to the animals, "and needed supplies. Your timing is fortunate. The town is unusually lively today." Finn stepped closer, his voice lowering slightly. To be honest, the timing isn't entirely coincidental. I heard in Helena that Russell's men were heading north for a few weeks. Seemed a good opportunity to conduct business without complications. You've been to Helena and back since. Hazel hesitated, aware they were potentially within earshot of others, since our unexpected meeting. Finn supplied with a slight smile. Yes, my sister needed help with some matters there. A small silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken questions and observations. Finn looked much as she remembered, perhaps a bit more formally dressed for town business, but with the same clear-eyed directness that had first struck her. "How have you been?" he asked finally. "No more adventures on dangerous trails, I hope." "None at all, Doctor. Matthews has been quite insistent that I take the long route around Russell's territory." Wise man. Finn's gaze traveled over her face as if reacquainting himself with her features. "You look well. Silverpine agrees with you." Hazel felt color rising in her cheeks under his scrutiny. "Thank you. I've been kept very busy, which helps the adjustment." From down the street came the sound of breaking glass and loud voices, cowboys enjoying their brief respite from the trail. "Have you eaten?" Finn asked suddenly. "I was planning to get some dinner at the hotel once I finished here." The invitation was unexpected but not unwelcome. "I haven't actually. Dr. Matthews is attending Mrs. Peterson's delivery, so I'm free until he sends for me." "Then would you do me the honor of joining me? It's not my cabin stew, but the hotel cook does a decent beefsteak." Hazel hesitated only briefly. Dining publicly with a man would certainly fuel town gossip, but she found she cared less about that prospect than she might have a month ago. "I'd like that," she said simply. An hour later, they sat at a corner table in the hotel's small dining room, plates of food before them and a candle flickering between them. The room was busier than usual due to the cattle drive visitors, which provided a measure of privacy amid the general bustle. "So tell me," Finn said after they'd exchanged initial pleasantries, "has Silverpine revealed any redeeming qualities since we last spoke?" Hazel considered the question as she cut into her steak. "It has, actually. The people are kinder than I initially gave them credit for. Beneath the rough exteriors, there's genuine community here." "But," Finn prompted, evidently hearing the reservation in her voice, "but I still feel like an outsider in many ways. The women are friendly, yet they don't quite know what to make of me, not quite a proper lady, not quite a medical professional." Finn nodded in understanding. "The frontier is slow to accept new ideas, even while it's creating them. The contradiction of the West." Their conversation flowed easily from there, touching on her work with the doctor, the recovery of a child she'd helped treat for pneumonia, the books Finn had recently acquired from a traveling salesman. There was a comfort between them that belied their brief acquaintance, as if they'd known each other far longer than a single evening and morning. "And your ranch?" Hazel asked as they lingered over coffee. "Has it suffered any more intrusions?" A shadow crossed Finn's face. "Not directly, but Russell's influence is growing. He's bought the claims of 2 neighboring homesteaders who couldn't hold out any longer. That must be concerning." "It is." Finn's fingers tapped thoughtfully against his cup. "My land isn't particularly valuable for mining, but it controls access to water that his operations need. It's only a matter of time before he makes an offer or a threat." Hazel leaned forward, troubled by his words. "Surely the law is 3 days' ride away, and the sheriff here owes his position to Russell's influence." Finn's expression softened as he noted her concern. "But don't worry about me. I'm not easily intimidated, and I have friends in the territory." Their meal concluded, Finn insisted on paying despite Hazel's protestations. As they stepped out onto the hotel porch, the evening had settled fully over Silverpine, lanterns glowing warmly in windows up and down the main street. "May I walk you back to the doctor's?" Finn asked, offering his arm in a gesture that seemed both old-fashioned and perfectly natural. Hazel placed her hand in the crook of his elbow, acutely aware of his solid presence beside her. "Thank you, it's not far." They strolled slowly, neither seeming eager to end their time together. The night air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke, and somewhere a piano played in one of the saloons. "When do you return to your ranch?" Hazel asked as they approached the doctor's office and residence. Tomorrow, Finn replied. Once I've concluded my business with the blacksmith. They paused at the gate to the small yard, facing each other in the soft glow spilling from the office windows. It was good to see you again, Miss Greene. Finn's voice had dropped to a lower register, intimate in the quiet evening. Hazel, she corrected gently. I think after sharing meals and outrunning gunmen, we might use first names. A smile touched his lips. Hazel, then. She was acutely aware of how close they stood, of the warmth of his body in the cool evening air, of how his eyes seemed to hold questions he wasn't asking aloud. I hope, she began, just as he said. Perhaps they both stopped, then laughed softly at the awkward timing. You first, Finn insisted. Hazel gathered her courage. I was going to say that I hope our paths might cross again, preferably without mortal danger involved. Something like relief crossed his features. I was about to suggest that very thing. I come to town every few weeks for supplies. Perhaps we could meet again then. I'd like that very much. For a moment, it seemed he might say more or perhaps do more, but the sound of approaching footsteps broke the spell between them. A couple walked past, nodding politely, and Finn stepped back slightly. Until next time, then, he said, tipping his hat. Good night, Hazel. Good night, Finn. She watched him walk away, his tall figure gradually blending with the shadows between the street lamps. Only when he had disappeared from view did she turn and enter the doctor's residence, her mind already counting the days until every few weeks might bring him back to Silverpine. The weeks that followed took on a new rhythm for Hazel. Her work with Dr. Matthews continued to challenge and fulfill her, but now there was an undercurrent of anticipation running beneath her daily routine. Each rider approaching from the direction of the mountains caught her attention. Each visit to the general store included a casual inquiry about supply wagons expected from outlying homesteads. 3 weeks after their dinner at the hotel, her patience was rewarded. She was sorting medicinal herbs in the doctor's office when a familiar figure appeared in the doorway, hat in hand and a tentative smile on his face. Good afternoon, Finn said, his voice instantly recognizable even before she looked up. I was hoping to find you here. Hazel rose from her work table, conscious of the herbal scents clinging to her apron and the loose strands of hair that had escaped her pins. Finn, I didn't know you were coming to town today. I wasn't certain myself until this morning, he admitted. But the weather looked favorable, and I had some business that wouldn't wait. Before she could respond, Dr. Matthews emerged from the back room, eyebrows rising at the sight of their visitor. Mr. Cooper, isn't it? The gentleman who assisted Miss Greene during that unfortunate incident. Yes, sir. Finn straightened slightly under the doctor's scrutiny. I was passing through town and thought I'd inquire after her well-being. Matthews glanced between them, a knowing look in his eye that made Hazel flush slightly. Very considerate of you. As it happens, I was just about to suggest that Miss Greene take some air. She's been cataloging herbs since dawn, and fresh perspective is valuable in such detailed work. The doctor's transparent matchmaking might have been embarrassing if Hazel hadn't been so grateful for it. That does sound refreshing, she agreed, untying her apron. Minutes later, she and Finn were walking along the boardwalk, the autumn sunshine warming the crisp afternoon air. Your doctor seems very understanding, Finn observed with a hint of amusement. Hazel shook her head, smiling. He's been dropping increasingly unsubtle hints about young people needing companionship ever since our dinner at the hotel became known to him. And does that bother you, the town's interest in your affairs? She considered the question seriously. Less than I expected it would. In Cincinnati, such attention would have mortified me. Here, it seems less important somehow. The mountains have a way of shifting one's perspective, Finn agreed. Troubles that seemed enormous back east become trivial when you're facing blizzards and grizzlies. They walked to the edge of town, where the boardwalk ended and a simple dirt path continued toward the nearby creek. By unspoken agreement, they followed it, the sounds of the town receding behind them. How is your ranch? Hazel asked as they reached the creek bank, where aspen leaves trembled gold in the breeze. Finn's expression grew more serious. Managing, though Russell continues to press from all sides. He's offered to buy me out for considerably less than the land is worth. And you refused, of course. He picked up a flat stone and skipped it across the water's surface. That land represents everything I've worked for these past 5 years. I won't surrender it to become another of Russell's conquests. Hazel studied his profile, noting the determination in the set of his jaw. It must be lonely, standing against such pressure. Finn turned to her, his eyes searching hers. It can be, though less so since I met a certain doctor's assistant who understands something about forging her own path. The compliment warmed her, and Hazel found herself stepping closer to him, drawn by something she couldn't quite name. I've thought of you often, she admitted quietly, of your cabin and our conversations by the fire. As have I. Finn's voice had dropped to match hers, creating an intimate space between them despite the open setting. More than I should, perhaps. The air seemed to still around them, the babbling creek and rustling leaves fading to background as Hazel became acutely aware of his proximity, of the way his gaze dropped briefly to her lips before returning to her eyes. Hazel, he began, then hesitated. I don't want to presume whatever he might have said was interrupted by shouting from the direction of town. They both turned to see a young boy running toward them along the path, waving frantically. Miss Greene, Miss Greene, the child called, his face flushed with exertion. Doc says come quick. There's been an accident at the sawmill. The moment shattered, Hazel stepped back, her professional instincts immediately taking precedence. I'll come right away, Tommy. She turned apologetically to Finn. I'm sorry, don't be, he said firmly. People need you, go. She hesitated only a moment longer, torn between duty and the conversation that had been building between them. Will you? I'll be in town until tomorrow, he assured her. Find me when you can. With a grateful nod, Hazel gathered her skirts and hurried after the boy, her mind already shifting to what supplies they might need for a sawmill injury, likely a severe laceration or crushed limb, possibly multiple victims. The remainder of the day passed in a blur of blood and bandages. 3 men had been injured when a log slipped from its securing chains, one with a broken arm, another with deep gashes requiring stitches, and the third with more serious internal injuries that left Dr. Matthews grave-faced, and Hazel praying for a miracle they both knew was unlikely. It was well past midnight when the third man finally succumbed to his injuries, leaving Hazel and the doctor exhausted and somber as they cleaned the surgery. You did everything possible, Matthews told her as she scrubbed blood from the examination table. Sometimes that's not enough out here. His wife, Hazel said softly, remembering the woman's face as they delivered the news. The children, the mill owner will provide some compensation, and the town will rally around them. The doctor removed his glasses, rubbing his reddened eyes. It's the way of things in Silver Pine. We look after our own, Hazel nodded, finding small comfort in the knowledge. In the 3 months since her arrival, she'd witnessed both the harshness of frontier life and the remarkable resilience of its people. Get some rest, Matthews advised, patting her shoulder. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, but sleep proved elusive that night. Hazel lay awake in her small room above the doctor's office, her mind replaying the days, events, the terror in the injured men's eyes, the doctor's steady hands despite the grim prognosis, the grief that had aged the widow by decades in a single moment. And beneath it all, like a current running through deep water, thoughts of Finn and their interrupted conversation by the creek. What had he been about to say? What might have happened if the boy hadn't come running with news of the accident? Dawn found her still awake, watching pale light gradually illuminate the simple furnishings of her room. With a sigh, she rose and dressed, knowing further rest would elude her. Perhaps fresh air would clear her mind before the day's patients began arriving. The town was quiet as she slipped out. Most establishments still shuttered in the early light. Hazel walked without particular destination, letting her feet carry her where they would while her thoughts continued to circle. Somehow, she wasn't surprised when her wandering led her to the livery stable, where several horses dozed in the corral, including a familiar dun gelding she recognized as Finn's mount. She hesitated at the edge of the yard, unsure of her purpose in coming here. It was far too early for social calls, and Finn was likely still asleep at the hotel or boarding house where he'd taken a room. As she stood deliberating, movement caught her eye, a figure emerging from the stable, carrying a saddle. Even in the dim light, she knew him immediately. Finn paused when he spotted her, setting the saddle on the fence rail. "Hazel," she stepped forward, suddenly self-conscious about her unplanned appearance. "I couldn't sleep. After yesterday, I needed." She gestured vaguely, unable to articulate exactly what she had needed. Understanding crossed his features. "The accident, was it bad? One man died," she said simply. "A husband and father of 4, Finn nodded solemnly, requiring no further explanation. Death was a constant companion on the frontier, appearing without warning or mercy. "I'm leaving," he said after a moment, gesturing to the saddle. "There's trouble brewing at the north end of the valley. A friend rode in late last night with news." Disappointment pierced through Hazel's fatigue. "Russell's men." "Yes. They've moved on to Peterson's old claim, the one that borders my eastern pasture." Finn's jaw tightened. "I need to secure my livestock before they decide my cattle have wandered onto their new property." "Of course," Hazel said, trying to mask her regret at his imminent departure. "You must protect what's yours." Finn stepped closer, his eyes searching her face. "I'm sorry about our interrupted conversation yesterday. I had hoped." "As did I," she admitted quietly. For a moment they stood in silence, the growing light casting long shadows across the yard. Then, with a decisiveness that took her by surprise, Finn closed the remaining distance between them. "I don't know when I'll be able to return to town," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Russell's men may keep me occupied for some time. But I want you to know that our brief acquaintance has meant more to me than I can properly express." Hazel's heart quickened at his words and proximity. "It has been significant to me as well." Finn hesitated, then reached out to gently touch her cheek, his calloused fingers surprisingly soft against her skin. "May I write to you? It's a poor substitute for conversation, but yes," she interrupted, certain of this if nothing else. "Please do." Relief and something warmer flashed in his eyes. For a breathtaking moment, Hazel thought he might kiss her there in the livery yard with dawn breaking around them. Instead, he took her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gesture both formal and deeply intimate. "Until we meet again," he said, releasing her hand reluctantly. "Be careful," she urged, suddenly fearful for him facing Russell's dangerous influence alone. Finn's smile held a touch of grimness. "Always. You take care as well, Hazel Greene. Silverpine needs its healing hands." She watched as he saddled his horse with efficient movements, each action speaking of years of practice. When he mounted, he paused to tip his hat to her one final time before urging his horse toward the trail that would lead him back to his embattled homestead. Hazel remained until horse and rider disappeared from view, the sun now fully risen and casting long rays across the awakening town. Only then did she turn back toward the doctor's office, her heart heavy with concern yet strangely lightened by the promise of letters to come. The first letter arrived 2 weeks later, delivered by a grizzled trapper who'd passed near Finn's ranch. Written in a surprisingly elegant hand on simple paper, it spoke of mounting tensions with Russell's men, of early snow on the high peaks, and of evenings spent reading Emerson by lamplight while thinking of conversations shared by firelight. Hazel read it a dozen times before composing her reply, which she entrusted to the mail carrier, who made monthly rounds to the outlying homesteads. In it, she described the rhythm of her days in Silverpine, the birth of twins to the blacksmith's wife, the arrival of a new schoolteacher from Vermont, and the quiet moments when she found herself gazing toward the mountains, wondering about life in a certain cabin among the pines. More letters followed, each treasured and carefully preserved. Through them, Hazel learned more about Finn than their brief encounters had revealed. His childhood in Pennsylvania, his time at university before the war diverted his plans, his journey west seeking not gold but purpose after the conflict's end. She shared her own history in return: her mother's early death, her father's gentle guidance, her thwarted ambitions to study medicine formally when no school would accept a female student. As winter settled fully over the Montana territory, the correspondence became their lifeline, connecting them across snow-laden miles. Dr. Matthews noted the pattern of Hazel's spirits rising whenever a letter arrived, but tactfully refrained from comment, beyond occasionally mentioning news. He'd heard about conditions near Cooper's Creek. In early December, a blizzard isolated Silverpine for nearly a week, roads impassable and communication with outlying areas impossible. When it finally cleared, Hazel found herself watching anxiously for any travelers who might bring news or letters from the northern valley. Relief came in the form of Joshua Harkins, a rancher whose property lay adjacent to Finn's, who struggled into town seeking medical attention for a badly frostbitten hand. "Foolishness," he grumbled as Dr. Matthews examined the blackened fingers. "Should have stayed put during the storm, but the wife was worried about her sister in Helena. How are things in your valley?" Hazel asked as casually as she could manage while preparing a poultice. "I understand there have been some property disputes." Harkins snorted. "That's putting it mildly." "Russell's boys shot up Anderson's place last month, claimed they were hunting strays, but everyone knows it was intimidation." Hazel's hand stilled. "And the other ranches, Cooper's place," the man gave her a knowing look. "Cooper's holding his own. Smart fellow, that one. Has friends among the Blackfoot who keep an eye on his northern boundary where Russell's men can't easily approach. He's well then," she pressed, abandoning pretense. "Was when I left, helping me dig out my barn after the worst of the blizzard." Harkins winced as the doctor probed a particularly damaged area. Mentioned he hadn't heard from town in a while, seemed concerned about someone here. Warmth spread through Hazel's chest despite the winter chill seeping through the office windows. "If you're returning that way, I have a letter that needs delivering," she said, earning another knowing look from both men. The weeks before Christmas brought increased activity to Silverpine despite the harsh weather. The hotel hosted a community dinner. The new schoolteacher organized a pageant with the town's children, and even Dr. Matthews decorated his office with pine boughs and red ribbons at Hazel's insistence. "First Christmas in Montana," he observed as she hung a small ornament her father had given her years ago. "Different from Cincinnati, I imagine." "Very," Hazel agreed, thinking of the formal parties and church services that had marked the season back east. "But there's a sincerity to it here that's refreshing." The doctor nodded, adding another log to the stove. "The territory strips away pretenses. For better or worse, people show their true nature here." On Christmas Eve, as Hazel was preparing to join the doctor for a quiet supper, a commotion outside drew her to the window. Through swirling snow, she could make out several riders coming down the main street, their horses laboring through the deep drifts. More patience. She wondered aloud, already reaching for her shawl. But as the riders drew closer, she recognized the lead figure, tall and straight-backed despite the punishing weather, his familiar hat pulled low against the wind. "Finn," she whispered, her breath fogging the cold glass. Without stopping for a coat, Hazel rushed outside, heedless of the snow immediately soaking her shoes and the hem of her dress. She reached the boardwalk just as the riders dismounted in front of the hotel, stamping and blowing to ward off the cold. Finn turned at her approach, his face reddened by wind but breaking into a smile that warmed her more effectively than any fire. "Hazel, what are you doing here?" she asked, snow collecting on her shoulders and hair. "The pass must be treacherous." "It was," he confirmed, stepping closer. The other riders, tactfully sensing a private moment, led their horses toward the livery stable. "But I couldn't let Christmas pass without seeing you." The simple declaration left her momentarily speechless. In all their correspondence, neither had explicitly stated the growing feelings between them, though every carefully chosen word had carried unspoken meaning. Finn reached out, brushing snowflakes from her hair with gentle fingers. "You're freezing. Let's get inside before Doctor Matthews has my head for endangering his assistant." Two moved to resist. Hazel allowed him to guide her back to the doctor's office, his hand warm against the small of her back. Inside, Matthews took one look at them, Finn's snow-covered but beaming, Hazel flushed and breathless, and announced he had an urgent matter to attend to at the church. "Don't wait supper," he called, donning his coat with suspicious haste. "These Christmas preparations may take some time." When the door closed behind him, Hazel found herself suddenly shy, despite months of intimate correspondence. Finn seemed similarly affected, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair in a gesture she recognized from their first meeting. "Your letters," he said finally, breaking the silence. "They've been my compass through this winter." "As yours have been mine," she replied softly. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see melting snowflakes on his eyelashes. "I rode through that pass for one reason, Hazel. To ask you something I couldn't put in a letter." Her heart quickened. "What is that?" "When spring comes," Finn said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes, "would you consider coming to Cooper's Creek not as a visitor or a friend, but as its mistress? As my wife?" Though not entirely unexpected given the tenor of their correspondence, the proposal still took her breath away. Marriage had been far from Hazel's mind when she'd accepted the position with Dr. Matthews. Indeed, she'd viewed coming west as an alternative to the matrimonial expectations that had constrained her in Cincinnati. Yet now, looking into Finn's earnest face, she realized that what he offered was fundamentally different from what she'd rejected back east. This wasn't a convenient arrangement or a social obligation, but a partnership of equals, forged through shared adversity and mutual respect. "Your silence concerns me," Finn said when she didn't immediately respond. "I understand if you need time to consider, or if your answer is no. I know what I'm asking you to give up your position here, the community you've built, perhaps even your medical work." "No," Hazel interrupted, finding her voice at last. "That's not it at all. I'm just overwhelmed that you came all this way through such conditions to ask me in person." Relief crossed his features. Some questions deserve to be asked face to face, and answered the same way, she said, gathering her courage. "Yes, Finn, when spring comes, I would be honored to become your wife." Joy transformed his expression, and in 2 quick steps, he closed the remaining distance between them, drawing her into an embrace that erased any lingering chill from her impromptu dash into the snow. "I've wanted to do this since the moment I saw you by the creek," Finn murmured, and then his lips were on hers, tentative at first, then more confident as she responded with equal fervor. The kiss deepened, months of separation and longing channeled into this first precious contact. Hazel's hands found their way to his shoulders, then his hair, as his arms tightened around her waist, pulling her closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Finn rested his forehead against hers. "Merry Christmas, Hazel Greene, soon to be Hazel Cooper, if I have any say in the matter." She laughed softly, joy bubbling up inside her like a spring thaw. "Merry Christmas, Finn." The remainder of winter passed in a flurry of preparations and planning, after a 2-day visit in Silverpine during which Finn formally asked Dr. Matthews for his blessing on the match, and was subjected to good-natured interrogation. From the town's more protective citizens, he returned to his ranch to prepare for spring and his bride-to-be. Their letters continued, now filled with practical discussions of household needs, planting schedules, and the improvements Finn was making to the cabin. He added a 2nd bedroom, expanded the kitchen, and ordered special books from Helena that he thought might help Hazel establish a small medical practice for the surrounding homesteads. For her part, Hazel divided her time between her duties at the doctor's office and assembling the items she would need as a rancher's wife. The women of Silverpine, delighted by the romance that had blossomed under their collective noses, showered her with gifts and advice, some practical, some alarmingly intimate, all well-intentioned. "You'll need sturdier boots," Mrs. Watkins advised during one of the sewing circles Hazel now attended with newfound enthusiasm, "and trousers for riding fence, scandalous elsewhere but necessary here." "And a good rifle," added the blacksmith's wife, a no-nonsense woman who had survived 3 Indian attacks in her 20 years on the frontier. "Cooper's a fine shot, but you should be able to defend yourself if needed, Dr. Matthews, though pleased for his assistant, grew increasingly concerned about finding a replacement before the spring thaw would allow Hazel to travel to her new home. "I've written to medical schools back east," he told her, "but qualified individuals are reluctant to venture this far into the territory." "What about Sarah Emmett?" Hazel suggested, referring to the widow of a former patient who had demonstrated remarkable aptitude while caring for her husband. She has a natural healing touch and she needs the income now. The doctor considered this. She's not formally trained. Neither was I when I arrived, Hazel reminded him, and she knows the local remedies better than either of us. I could spend my remaining time training her in your methods. By late March, the snow began to recede from the valley, revealing muddy roads and the first tentative shoots of new growth. With the changing season came increased traffic between outlying areas and town, and Hazel found herself watching for each arrival, hoping for news or letters from Cooper's Creek. Word came instead in the form of Joshua Harkins, the neighbor whose frostbitten hand had healed with only minimal scarring under her care. He rode into town one blustery afternoon, his expression grim as he requested an immediate audience with the sheriff. Hazel, who had been restocking supplies at the general store, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the spring wind when she heard his name mentioned by the storekeeper. "Harkins is saying there's been trouble up north," the man told his wife as he measured coffee beans. Something about Russell's men crossing boundaries. Without waiting to hear more, Hazel abandoned her purchases and hurried to the sheriff's office, her heart pounding with dread. She arrived to find Harkins in heated conversation with Sheriff Delaney, a man whose election had indeed been heavily influenced by Russell mining interests. "Telling you, they weren't just passing through," Harkins was saying as she entered. "They were armed and looking for trouble." Delaney noticed Hazel and straightened, his demeanor cooling. "Miss Greene, this is official business. It concerns me directly if it involves Cooper's Creek," she replied, refusing to be dismissed. "What's happened, Mr. Harkins?" The rancher turned to her, sympathy softening his weathered features. "Russell's foreman and 6 men rode onto Finn's property yesterday, claiming they were pursuing stolen cattle. Words were exchanged, then gunfire. The room seemed to tilt beneath Hazel's feet. Finn. "Is he alive?" Harkins assured her quickly. "But wounded. Took a bullet in the shoulder. My wife's tending to him, but he needs proper medical attention." Relief warred with fear in Hazel's chest. "I'll come immediately. Dr. Matthews and I." "Now hold on," Sheriff Delaney interrupted. "This sounds like a legitimate dispute over livestock. If Cooper was harboring stolen cattle, there were no stolen cattle," Harkins snapped. "It was a pretext for intimidation, same as they've been doing all winter. Russell wants that water access, and he's getting desperate with spring planting coming." The sheriff's expression remained skeptical, but Hazel had already made her decision. "I'm going to him," she declared. "Sheriff, you can investigate the so-called theft at your leisure, but a man is wounded and requires care." Without waiting for a response, she turned and hurried to the doctor's office, her mind racing with preparations. "Doctor." Matthews, alarmed by her breathless explanation, immediately began gathering surgical supplies. "The wound is at least a day old," he cautioned as they worked. "Infection is the primary concern now." "I know," Hazel said grimly, packing antiseptics and clean bandages, "if it's reached the bone." The doctor placed a steadying hand on her arm. "One step at a time. Cooper is strong and healthy. Those factors count significantly in his favor." Within the hour, they were mounted and ready, Harkins leading the way with Hazel and the doctor following. The journey would take most of the day over still muddy trails, but Hazel barely registered the discomfort or fatigue, her thoughts fixed solely on reaching Finn. As they rode, Harkins filled in the details of the confrontation. Russell's men had arrived unannounced, ostensibly searching for cattle bearing their brand. When Finn requested they leave his property, words escalated to threats and finally to violence. "Cooper wasn't even armed when they first approached," Harkins said disgustedly. "He was mending fence on the south pasture. Only reason he's alive is because his Blackfoot friend was hunting nearby and heard the shots. Scared Russell's boys off before they could finish what they started." The sun was lowering toward the western peaks when they finally crested the ridge overlooking Cooper's Creek. From this vantage point, Hazel could see the entire homestead, the cabin with its wraparound porch, the barn and corral, the creek winding through meadows now emerging from winter's grip. It should have been a triumphant moment, her first view of what would soon be her home. Instead, anxiety knotted her stomach as they descended the trail toward the cabin, where smoke rose steadily from the chimney. Mrs. Harkins met them at the door, her apron stained with what Hazel immediately recognized as blood. "Thank the Lord you've come," the woman said, ushering them inside. "The fever started last night." Hazel's medical training took over as she entered the cabin's main room, where Finn lay on a bed that had been moved near the fire. His face was flushed with fever, his breathing shallow, and a hasty bandage covered his left shoulder, dark with seepage. "Finn," she whispered, kneeling beside him. His eyelids fluttered at her voice but didn't open. Dr. Matthews wasted no time in examining the wound, his expression growing more concerned as he removed the soiled bandages. "The bullet went clean through," he reported, "but there's significant infection. We need to clean and drain it immediately." What followed was the most harrowing procedure of Hazel's medical career. Though she had assisted the doctor with countless surgeries, none had involved someone she loved, someone whose pain she felt as keenly as her own. She forced herself to focus on each task, preparing instruments, administering chloroform, holding retractors as Matthews debrided the infected tissue, her training providing a barrier against the terror that threatened to overwhelm her. Through it all, Finn remained mercifully unconscious, the chloroform sparing him the worst of the procedure's pain. When it was finally complete, the wound properly cleaned and bandaged, Hazel sat beside him, bathing his fevered brow with cool water from the creek. "The next 24 hours will tell," Matthews said gently, washing blood from his hands in a basin. "I've done all I can surgically. Now it's a matter of fighting the infection that's already in his system." Hazel nodded, not trusting her voice. The Harkins had tactfully withdrawn to their own home after the surgery, promising to return in the morning to help with chores and bring fresh supplies. "You should rest," the doctor continued, noting her exhaustion. "I can watch him for a few hours." "No," Hazel said quietly, "I'll stay with him." "Please get some sleep yourself. There's a bedroom through that door." Matthews seemed about to argue but thought better of it. "Call me if his condition changes for better or worse." When the doctor had retired, Hazel found herself alone with Finn for the first time in the home he had prepared for their life together. She looked around the cabin, noting the improvements he described in his letters: the expanded kitchen with its new cast iron stove, the bookshelves now filled with medical texts alongside his beloved philosophy volumes, the braided rug before the hearth that hadn't been there during her first visit. Everything spoke of his care and consideration, his determination to make this place worthy of the woman he loved. The thought that he might never see her appreciation of his efforts was unbearable. "You can't leave me now," she whispered fiercely, taking his hand in hers. "Not when we're so close to beginning our life together. Fight, Finn, please fight." Through the long night, Hazel maintained her vigil, applying cool compresses when his fever spiked, carefully administering water when he seemed able to swallow, and speaking softly to him during moments of restlessness. She told him about her journey from Silverpine, about the wildflowers beginning to bloom in the meadows they'd passed, about her plans for a garden behind the cabin once she'd settled in. "Mrs. Watkins gave me raspberry cuttings," she said, stroking his hand. "She says they'll flourish along the south wall where the sun is strongest. And I thought perhaps a small herb garden for medicinals closer to the kitchen door." She continued this one-sided conversation through the darkest hours, finding comfort in imagining their future even as fear for that very future consumed her. Sometime near dawn, exhaustion finally overcame her, and she drifted into an uneasy sleep, her head resting against the edge of the bed, her hand still clasping his. "Hazel." The voice, weak but unmistakable, drew her instantly awake. Finn's eyes were open, clear and focused on her face despite the lingering flush of fever in his cheeks. "Finn," she gasped, immediately pressing her palm to his forehead. The burning heat of the previous night had subsided to merely unusual warmth. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by a particularly vengeful bull," he rasped, attempting a smile that turned to a wince as he tried to shift position. "But better for seeing you." Relief washed over Hazel in a dizzying wave. Don't move, she cautioned, reaching for the water cup. The bullet tore through muscle and possibly nicked the bone. You've been very ill. Finn accepted the water gratefully, his eyes never leaving her face as she helped him drink. How did you know? He asked after satisfying his thirst. Mr. Harkins came to town, she explained, setting aside the cup to check his bandages. Dr. Matthews and I rode out immediately. Matthews is here too. Finn glanced toward the bedroom door. Yes, though I insisted on taking the night watch. Hazel carefully lifted the edge of the bandage, relieved to see the angry redness already receding from the wound edges. You'll need to stay very still for several days. The infection was severe. Finn's hand found hers, squeezing weakly. I'm sorry, Hazel. This isn't how I wanted to welcome you to our home. Hush, she said firmly. The only thing that matters is your recovery. His eyes searched hers, reading the fear and exhaustion written there. You thought you might lose me. It wasn't a question, but Hazel nodded, tears threatening for the first time since she'd received the news. Yes, never, Finn whispered, tugging her hand to bring her closer. I have too much to live for now. The simple declaration broke the last of her professional composure, and Hazel bent to press her lips gently to his, mindful of his weakened state, yet needing the contact to reassure herself of his presence, his life, his love. When she straightened, she found Dr. Matthews standing in the bedroom doorway, observing them with a mixture of professional assessment and paternal affection. Your patient appears to be improving, Miss Greene, he said with the ghost of a smile, though I might suggest more conventional treatments going forward. Hazel blushed but didn't move from Finn's side. His fever has broken and he's lucid. Excellent progress. The doctor approached to conduct his own examination, nodding with satisfaction at what he found. Still, we're not out of the woods yet. Complete rest, plenty of fluids, and continued wound care are essential. Under Miss Greene's supervision, I'll be the most cooperative patient in the territory, Finn promised, his voice stronger despite his obvious fatigue. Matthews raised an eyebrow. See that you are. I have other patients requiring my attention in Silverpine. Understanding dawned on Hazel. You're returning to town. Tomorrow, yes. The doctor's expression softened. Unless you feel my continued presence is medically necessary. Hazel glanced at Finn, whose eyes held a question he wouldn't voice aloud whether she would stay or return with the doctor. I believe I can manage his care, she said carefully, if you're certain you can spare me from the practice for a while longer. I think we both know your place is here now, Matthews replied with gentle frankness. Mrs. Emmett has proven quite capable in your absence, and the spring thaw was always our agreed timeline for your departure. Relief and gratitude washed over Hazel. The doctor was offering her a graceful transition, not an assistant abandoning her post in crisis, but a planned succession slightly accelerated by circumstances. Thank you, she said simply. Matthews nodded, understanding all she didn't say. Now, I believe our patient needs rest, and you, my dear, need breakfast. I heard the Harkins woman arrive with provisions while you were attending to Mr. Cooper. The following days established a new rhythm at Cooper's Creek. Dr. Matthews departed as planned, leaving detailed instructions for Finn's continued care and a promise to return in 2 weeks to check his progress. The Harkins helped with essential ranch work, ensuring livestock was tended and repairs made while Finn recovered and Hazel settled into her new role. For Hazel, the circumstances of her arrival, while far from ideal, provided an unexpected period of adjustment. Rather than arriving as a bride nervous about her new responsibilities, she came as a healer confident in her abilities, gradually incorporating domestic duties as Finn's condition improved. This isn't how I imagined our first weeks together, Finn remarked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching spring sunset paint the mountains in gold and crimson. His arm remained in a sling, but he'd regained enough strength to move around the cabin and even walk short distances outside. Nor I, Hazel admitted, her hand finding his on the armrest between their chairs, but perhaps it's fitting in its way. Finn turned to her, curiosity in his eyes. How so? We met because you rescued me, she explained. Now our life together begins because I helped rescue you. There's a certain symmetry to it. A smile spread across his features, still leaner than they should be but regaining color with each passing day. I hadn't considered that, though I'd prefer if our future together involves considerably less mortal danger. Agreed, Hazel laughed, then grew more serious. Speaking of danger, has there been any word about Russell and his men? The incident that had nearly cost Finn his life remained unresolved. Sheriff Delaney had made a cursory visit to the ranch during Finn's early recovery, taking statements, but making no arrests despite Harkins's eyewitness account corroborating Finn's version of events. Nothing official, Finn replied, his expression hardening. But Joshua heard rumors in town that Russell's lost financial backing from Helena after word spread about the shooting. Seems his Eastern investors are concerned about legal complications. Good, Hazel said with uncharacteristic vehemence. Though it hardly seems sufficient punishment for attempted murder. Finn's hand tightened around hers. The territory has its own form of justice, beyond what sheriffs and courts can provide. Russell's reputation is damaged, and out here, reputation is currency. He'll find it harder to hire men, secure contracts, or expand his operations. And us, will he retaliate? I don't believe so, not directly at least. Finn gazed out at the land he'd fought to protect. He's a businessman above all else. With his financing in jeopardy, he can't afford further scandal. We'll remain vigilant, but I think the worst has passed. As the weeks progressed, this assessment proved accurate. Russell's operations continued, but his men gave Cooper's Creek a wide berth, and rumors circulated that he was considering selling his Montana holdings to focus on more profitable ventures in Idaho. With the immediate threat receding, Hazel and Finn turned their attention to their future together. Though they had planned a June wedding in Silver Pine's small church, circumstances had brought Hazel to the ranch months earlier than anticipated, creating an unusual situation that didn't escape the notice of visiting neighbors. People are talking, Mrs. Harkins mentioned delicately during one of her visits, while Finn was occupied with Joshua inspecting fences. About you two living here unmarried. Hazel looked up from the bread dough she was kneading. I'm here as his nurse, she said, though she knew the explanation sounded increasingly thin as Finn recovered. Of course you are, the older woman agreed with knowing kindness. And no one with sense would suggest otherwise, but sense isn't always abundant, even on the frontier. The conversation planted a seed that germinated in Hazel's thoughts over the following days. While she wasn't overly concerned with conventional propriety, her decision to become a doctor's assistant had already placed her outside traditional female roles. She respected the community they would build their life within. More importantly, she found herself increasingly impatient to begin their marriage in truth rather than just anticipation. Living in the cabin with Finn, sharing meals and conversations, watching the land come alive with spring growth, all of it felt right in a way nothing in her life had before. One evening in late April, as they sat before the fire reading companionably, Hazel set aside her book and turned to Finn. I've been thinking, she began, drawing his attention from his own volume. A dangerous pastime, he teased, marking his place with a finger. Perhaps, she acknowledged with a smile, but I wonder if you might consider a change to our plans. Finn's expression grew more serious. What sort of change? Our wedding, Hazel said, gathering her courage. I know we planned for June in Silver Pine, but I find myself reluctant to wait, or to leave here even temporarily now that I've arrived. Understanding dawned in Finn's eyes, followed by something warmer. Are you proposing we marry sooner, Hazel Greene? I am, she confirmed, her cheeks warming under his intent gaze. Perhaps here at Cooper's Creek with just a few friends as witnesses. Judge Patterson makes circuit rounds next week, according to Mrs. Harkins. Finn set his book aside entirely and moved to kneel before her chair, taking both her hands in his. His wounded shoulder had healed enough to abandon the sling, though he still favored that arm. Nothing would make me happier than making you my wife as soon as possible, he said earnestly. But are you certain? Women often dream of proper weddings, and you've had precious little time to prepare. Hazel squeezed his hands, touched by his consideration. I've never been one for elaborate celebrations. What matters to me is beginning our life together officially, here in the home you've built for us." Joy transformed Finn's features, and he rose enough to kiss her properly, something that had become increasingly frequent and ardent during his recovery. "Then let's do it," he said when they finally broke apart. "Next week, here at Cooper's Creek, a small ceremony with those who matter most to us." The following days passed in a flurry of preparations. Invitations were sent to Dr. Matthews, the Harkins, Finn's sister and Helena, and a few other neighbors and friends. The cabin was thoroughly cleaned, spring flowers gathered for simple decorations, and the best china unpacked from crates Hazel had shipped from Silverpine. For her wedding dress, Hazel rejected the elaborate gowns favored back east in favor of a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes. Mrs. Harkins contributed a handmade lace collar as something borrowed, and Finn's sister Margaret arrived 2 days before the ceremony with a pearl hairpin that had belonged to their mother. "He wrote about you all winter," Margaret confided as she helped Hazel try different arrangements for her hair. "I've never seen my brother so completely smitten or so determined to make a place worthy of the woman he loves." The wedding day dawned clear and mild, with wildflowers carpeting the meadow and birds singing in the pines surrounding the homestead. Judge Patterson arrived mid-morning, his judicial dignity somewhat at odds with the trail dust on his coat, but his genuine pleasure in the occasion evident in his hearty congratulations. By noon, the small gathering of guests had assembled on the porch and in the yard, where Finn stood waiting beside the judge, freshly shaved and wearing a new shirt beneath his best vest. His face, when he turned to watch Hazel approach from the cabin door, held such naked adoration that several of the assembled women dabbed discreetly at their eyes. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful, the traditional vows carrying special weight for a couple who had already demonstrated their commitment through life-threatening circumstances. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Finn's kiss held both tenderness and promise, sealing their union before friends who had become family in this remote corner of the territory. The celebration continued through the afternoon and into evening, with food and drink flowing freely, music provided by Joshua Harkins's surprisingly accomplished fiddle playing, and stories shared of both bride and groom that brought laughter and occasional blushes to their faces. As twilight gathered, the guests gradually departed, some to nearby homesteads, others to rooms arranged at the Harkins Ranch for those traveling from farther away. Dr. Matthews was the last to leave, pulling Hazel aside for a moment before mounting his horse. "I couldn't be prouder if you were my own daughter," he said gruffly, his usual professional demeanor softened by emotion and perhaps a glass or two of whiskey. "You found your place in this territory, Hazel Cooper, and it suits you well." Hazel embraced him, grateful for his role in bringing her west and into Finn's path. "I'll never forget all you've taught me," she promised, "and I hope you'll call on me if medical needs arise in this area." "Count on it," he assured her, then turned to shake Finn's hand one final time. "Take care of each other. The frontier demands no less." When the last hoofbeats had faded down the trail, Hazel and Finn stood alone on the porch of their cabin, now truly theirs in every sense. The first stars were appearing overhead, and from the forest came the evening chorus of insects and night birds. "Mrs. Cooper," Finn said softly, drawing her into his arms, "welcome home." Hazel leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid strength of him, the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. "It's been home since I first arrived," she murmured, "even with you half conscious with fever." Finn laughed quietly, the sound rumbling through his chest. "Not the romantic beginning I'd planned for us, but perfectly us nonetheless." Hazel lifted her face to his, the day's joy still radiant in her expression. "I wouldn't change a moment of our journey here." His kiss was answer enough, and as darkness settled fully over Cooper's Creek, they entered their cabin together no longer as patient and nurse, or even as bride and groom, but as partners in the truest sense, facing whatever the territory might bring with the strength they'd found in each other. 5 years later, Hazel stood on that same porch in the gentle light of dawn, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the early morning chill. Behind her, the cabin slept Finn in their bed, their 3-year-old son Thomas in his small room, and baby Margaret in her cradle beside the parents' bed. The ranch had prospered under their joint stewardship. The original cabin had been expanded twice to accommodate their growing family. A proper surgery now stood adjacent to the main house, where Hazel treated patients from surrounding homesteads and ranches 3 days each week. The reputation of Doc Cooper, as she was now known, despite lacking formal credentials, had spread throughout the valley, bringing a steady stream of those seeking care they would otherwise travel days to find. Finn's cattle operation had grown as well, with additional grazing land purchased when Russell finally sold his Montana holdings and returned east. The water rights that had once been cause for bloodshed now supported not only their livestock, but also the most productive vegetable garden in the county, Hazel's pride, and a source of both food and medicine for their family and neighbors. Yet despite their success and happiness, a shadow had recently fallen across their hard-won stability. A letter had arrived the previous week from Hazel's aunt in Cincinnati, her father's sister, with whom she had maintained sporadic correspondence since coming west. The older woman was ailing and alone, imploring her niece to consider returning, if only temporarily, to help settle her affairs. The request had awakened memories of the life Hazel had left behind, the ordered streets and cultural amenities of the city, the society she had once moved within, the opportunities her children might never know in this remote territory. While she loved Cooper's Creek with every fiber of her being, the letter had planted a seed of restlessness that had grown into something she could no longer ignore. Last night, after the children were asleep, she had finally voiced her thoughts to Finn. "I think I should go," she'd said quietly as they sat before the fire. "Just for a few months. Annalena has no one else, and she was kind to me after Father died." Finn had listened without interruption as she explained her reasoning, her sense of obligation, her desire for the children to know something of her origins, her belief that the journey would be manageable now that the railroad extended much closer to their territory. "And you'll return?" He'd asked finally, his voice carefully neutral. The question had pierced her heart with its vulnerability. "Of course I'll return. This is our home, Finn. You are my home." He'd nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "When would you go?" "The spring stage leaves from Helena next week. We could be back before winter sets in." They had discussed practical arrangements, how the surgery would be temporarily closed, which neighbors might help with household matters, how frequently letters could be exchanged. Throughout the conversation, Finn had been supportive yet reserved, his usual openness shadowed by something Hazel couldn't quite identify. Now, as dawn painted the eastern sky in pink and gold, Hazel found herself plagued by doubt. Was she being selfish, uprooting her children for a journey of over 1,000 miles? Was she asking too much of Finn, leaving him to manage the ranch while she fulfilled an obligation to a relative he'd never met? More troubling was a fear she barely dared acknowledge that once back in Cincinnati, surrounded by the refinements of city life, she might find herself questioning the choices that had brought her to this wild, beautiful, demanding place. Lost in these thoughts, she didn't hear the cabin door open behind her until Finn's arms encircled her waist, his chin coming to rest on her shoulder. "You're up early," he murmured, his voice still rough with sleep. Hazel leaned back against him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "I couldn't sleep." Having second thoughts about the journey, she turned in his arms to face him, searching his expression in the growing light. "Should I be?" Finn studied her face, his blue eyes serious beneath sleep-tousled hair. "That depends on why you're going." "I told you Annalena needs know," he interrupted gently. "The deeper reason, the one you haven't said aloud." Hazel dropped her gaze, momentarily unable to meet the understanding in his eyes. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do." Finn's hand came up to tilt her chin, forcing her to look at him again. "Part of you wants to see if Cincinnati still feels like home, if the life you left behind might still fit." The accuracy of his assessment startled her. "How did you know?" "Because I know you, Hazel Cooper. Better than anyone." His smile held a touch of sadness. and because it's natural to wonder about paths not taken, especially when you've chosen one as demanding as this. Hazel's throat tightened with emotion. I love our life here. I love you and the children more than I could ever express. I know that too, Finn assured her, and it's why I want you to go. What? Hazel blinked in surprise. I want you to go to Cincinnati, help your aunt, and see the city through the eyes of the woman you've become. His hands moved to cup her face gently. Because I believe with all my heart that you'll come back to us, not out of obligation or habit, but because you choose this life again, knowing fully what the alternatives might be. Tears welled in Hazel's eyes at the profound trust implicit in his words. And if I don't come back? Finn's expression remained steady, though something flickered in the depths of his gaze. Then, I would know that I'd kept you here against your true heart's desire, and that would be a far greater loss than your physical absence. The enormity of his love, its generosity, and courage overwhelmed her. This man, who had fought for his land against impossible odds, who had nearly died defending what was his, was willing to risk losing her rather than clip her wings. I will come back, she whispered fiercely. Nothing in Cincinnati or anywhere else could keep me from you and our children. Then go with my blessing, Finn said simply, and know that we'll be waiting for your return however long it takes. The week passed in a whirlwind of preparations. Trunks were packed, arrangements made for the stagecoach journey to Helena and the subsequent train travel east. Neighbors promised to look in on Finn and bring meals occasionally, though he assured everyone he was perfectly capable of managing the household in Hazel's absence. The night before their departure, after the children were finally asleep, Thomas excited about the adventure ahead. Baby Margaret blissfully unaware of the changes coming. Hazel and Finn lay together in their bed, holding each other with an intensity born of impending separation. 3 months, Hazel murmured against his chest. No longer, I promise. Finn's fingers trailed through her unbound hair, memorizing its texture. Take whatever time you need, we'll be here. When dawn broke, Hazel was already awake, watching the familiar light gradually illuminate their bedroom. Soon Thomas would burst in, eager to begin the journey he'd been anticipating all week. Margaret would wake hungry and demanding, oblivious to the significance of the day. But for this moment, Hazel allowed herself to absorb every detail of the room she and Finn had shared for 5 years. The quilt her mother-in-law had made as a wedding gift, the pressed wildflowers in a frame on the wall, the worn spot on the floorboard near Finn's side of the bed where he stood each morning to dress. Beside her, Finn stirred, his arm tightening around her waist. Watching me sleep, watching our home, she corrected softly, committing it to memory. He pressed a kiss to her shoulder. It will be waiting for you unchanged. But as they rose to begin the day's momentous tasks, Hazel knew that wasn't entirely true. She would return changed by her journey, and home would be different through her transformed perspective. The question was whether those changes would strengthen or weaken the bonds tying her to this place and this man. The moment of departure arrived too quickly, and not quickly enough. The wagon was loaded, the children settled with toys and blankets for the first leg of their journey, the house secured for Finn's bachelor occupancy. Standing before the cabin that had witnessed their love story's most significant chapters, Hazel found herself unexpectedly hesitant. Are you certain you'll be all right? Finn smiled, though his eyes betrayed the pain of their parting. I survived on my own for years before a certain doctor's assistant came into my life. I expect I can manage a few months. Yes, but you've grown accustomed to civilized company since then, she teased, trying to lighten the moment. True enough. He pulled her into a final embrace, his voice dropping to a whisper meant for her alone. Come back to me, Hazel, not for duty or the children or even this land. Come back because your heart leads you here. She kissed him with all the love and certainty she possessed, then reluctantly pulled away. I will, I promise. With Thomas chattering excitedly and Margaret secure in her arms, Hazel climbed into the wagon where Joshua Harkins waited to drive them to the stagecoach station. As they pulled away, she turned for one last look at the tableau that had become the center of her world. Finn standing on the porch, tall and steady, his hand raised in farewell. The journey east proved every bit as challenging as Hazel had anticipated. The stagecoach rattled mercilessly over rough roads. The trains were crowded and smoke-filled, and managing two small children through it all tested her patience and ingenuity daily. Yet there was exhilaration, too, in showing Thomas the vastness of the country, in seeing the wonder in his eyes as mountains gave way to plains, and plains to the verdant farmlands of the Midwest. Cincinnati, when they finally arrived, seemed both familiar and utterly foreign. The city had grown in the years of her absence, with new buildings rising along streets she once knew intimately. Her aunt's home in a respectable neighborhood near the river remained largely unchanged. However, a solid brick residence filled with the furnishings and memorabilia of a long, comfortable life. Hazel Greene, now 70 and frail but still sharp-minded, welcomed her niece and great-niece and nephew with genuine joy. Though initially taken aback by Thomas's frontier mannerisms and vocabulary, she quickly became his devoted advocate, defending his refreshing naturalness to the more straight-laced members of her social circle who found the boy's directness disconcerting. The early weeks of their visit passed in a flurry of medical consultations for Aunt Hazel, legal meetings regarding her estate, and social calls from old family friends curious about Hazel's adventure in the territories. Most viewed her life in Montana with a mixture of horror and fascination, unable to conceive of choosing such primitive conditions over the comforts of civilization. "But my dear, surely you must miss proper society," one of her father's former business associates commented during a tea arranged in her honor. "And the children's education, what opportunities can they possibly have in such a wilderness?" Hazel found herself increasingly defensive of her adopted home. "We have community, Mrs. Witherspoon, though it looks different from what you know here. And as for education, Thomas already reads beyond his years, taught by parents who value knowledge precisely because it isn't taken for granted where we live." Such exchanges left her both irritated and reflective. The Cincinnati of her youth had shaped her in undeniable ways: her speech, her manners, her appreciation for literature and music. Yet she found herself chafing at the restrictions that had once seemed natural, the rigid social expectations that constrained women's roles and aspirations. "You've changed," Aunt Hazel observed one evening as they sat in the parlor, Hazel writing her weekly letter to Finn while the children slept upstairs. "There's a certainty about you that wasn't there before." Hazel looked up from her letter, considering this assessment. "I suppose I have. The territory doesn't allow for hesitation or self-doubt, not if you want to survive. It's more than that." The older woman's eyes were shrewd beneath her lace cap. "You've found purpose there, and love, of course, but purpose seems to sustain you even more." The observation struck Hazel as profoundly true. In Cincinnati, she had been her father's daughter, defined by family connections and social standing. In Montana, she was defined by what she contributed: her medical skills, her labor on the ranch, her strength in building a home and family in challenging circumstances. "I miss it," she admitted, setting down her pen. "Every day. I miss the mountains and the clean air and the way the light changes over the valley. I miss our neighbors dropping by without formal invitations, bringing whatever they've harvested or hunted to share. And your husband," Hazel added gently. "You miss him most of all." Hazel nodded, a familiar ache swelling in her chest. Finn's letters arrived regularly but couldn't replace his physical presence, his quiet strength, the way he anticipated her needs before she voiced them. "He gave me the freedom to come here," she said softly. "Even knowing I might choose not to return." Her aunt's eyebrows rose slightly. "Would you choose to stay in Cincinnati?" The question hung in the air between them, giving voice to the unspoken possibility that had shadowed Hazel's journey from the beginning. Here was comfort, culture, convenience, all the things the frontier lacked. Here was a society that would welcome her children into its fold, providing education and opportunities beyond what Montana could offer. Yet as she considered the question honestly, Hazel found her answer crystallizing with absolute clarity. "No," she said firmly. "I wouldn't. I couldn't." The conviction in her voice must have satisfied her aunt, who nodded as if confirming something she'd already suspected. Then perhaps it's time to think about your return journey. I'm much improved, thanks largely to your care, and my affairs are in order. There's no need to extend your visit on my account." Hazel studied the older woman's face, searching for signs of manipulation or martyrdom, but found only genuine affection and understanding. "Are you certain? We agreed on 3 months and it's barely been 2. "I'm certain that a woman should be where her heart resides," Alina replied simply. "And yours, my dear, is clearly in Montana with your Finn and the life you've built together." That night, after adding a postscript to her letter informing Finn of their earlier-than-planned return, Hazel lay awake in the comfortable guest room of her aunt's house. The mattress was softer than her bed at Cooper's Creek, the linens finer, the street outside occasionally disturbed by passing carriages rather than coyotes or owls. Yet for all its comforts, it wasn't home. Home was a cabin with a wraparound porch, books lining rough-hewn shelves, and a man whose blue eyes saw her more clearly than anyone ever had. 2 weeks later, Hazel stood on the platform of the Cincinnati train station, Thomas clutching her hand and Margaret secure in her arms. Aunt Alina had come to see them off, her recent health improvements allowing the excursion with the support of her longtime housekeeper. "Right when you arrive safely," the older woman instructed, embracing Hazel carefully around the baby. "And know that you're welcome to visit anytime, though I suspect it may be many years before you venture east again." "Thank you for understanding," Hazel said, blinking back tears. Despite her certainty about returning to Montana, leaving her aunt possibly for the last time, given her age, was painful. "There's nothing to understand," Alina replied briskly, though her own eyes were suspiciously bright. "You've found your place in the world, which is more than most people ever manage. Now go home to it." The westward journey seemed both endless and too brief endless in the physical discomfort and challenges of traveling with children. Too brief in the time it allowed Hazel to prepare herself for the reunion with Finn. Would he see the changes in her that others had remarked upon? Would he sense her absolute certainty about their life together, now tested and confirmed by comparison with the alternatives? From Helena, they took the stagecoach south, and for the final leg of their journey, Joshua Harkins met them with the wagon, his weathered face breaking into a wide grin at the sight of them descending from the coach. "The prodigal family returns," he called, helping them with their luggage. "And a week early, by my reckoning. We found our business concluded sooner than expected," Hazel explained, noting with amusement that Thomas had already reverted to his frontier mannerisms, climbing expertly into the wagon bed without assistance. "How is everything at Cooper's Creek?" "Thriving, though your husband's been like a bear with a sore paw since you left." Harkins secured their trunks and helped Hazel up to the seat beside him, threw himself into work from dawn till dusk. "Built that new storage shed you'd been talking about, expanded the corral, even painted the surgery inside and out." The thought of Finn channeling his loneliness into improvements for their home touched Hazel deeply. "Does he know we're returning today?" "No, madam," Harkins replied with a twinkle in his eye. "Thought you might want to surprise him. He's due back from the north pasture around supper time, according to what he told Sarah when she brought over a meal yesterday." The idea of surprising Finn appealed to Hazel's romantic nature, and she agreed eagerly to Harkins's suggestion that they arrive just before dusk, when Finn would be returning from his day's work. As the wagon rumbled along familiar roads, Hazel felt her spirits lifting with each mile that brought them closer to Cooper's Creek. The mountains rose majestic against the sky, the summer wildflowers carpeted meadows in riotous color, and the scent of pine and sage filled the air, all so different from Cincinnati's urban landscape. "Almost home, Mama?" Thomas asked, his head popping up between her and Harkins from the wagon bed where he'd been playing with his sister. "Almost home," she confirmed, her heart swelling with the truth of those words. The sun was indeed lowering toward the western peaks when they crested the final ridge overlooking the ranch. From this vantage point, Hazel could see the cabin with its expanded wings, the barn and corral, the garden she'd planted now lush with summer growth, and the small surgery with its fresh coat of white paint gleaming in the late afternoon light. "There it is, children," she said softly. "There's our home." As Harkins guided the wagon down the slope, Hazel's anticipation grew. There was no sign yet of Finn returning from the north pasture, but smoke rose from the cabin chimney, suggesting he'd laid a fire before leaving that morning to take the chill off the evening air. They pulled into the yard just as the sun touched the mountaintops, casting long shadows across the clearing. Harkins helped them down, then quickly unloaded their trunks onto the porch. "I'll leave you folks to your reunion," he said with a knowing smile. "Sarah will have my hide if I'm late for supper." With a tip of his hat, he climbed back onto the wagon and turned toward the trail that would lead to his own ranch a few miles distant. Left alone with the children, Hazel felt a sudden flutter of nerves. "Let's go inside and get settled," she suggested, taking Margaret from Thomas's arms. "Papa will be home soon." The cabin welcomed them with familiar scents and sights: wood smoke, coffee, the books lining the shelves, the quilt draped over Finn's favorite chair. Everything was meticulously clean and orderly, belying the bachelor occupancy of the past weeks. On the table stood a vase of wildflowers, freshly gathered, as if Finn had been preparing for guests. "Can I go see the chickens?" Thomas asked, already heading for the door after depositing his small travel bag in his room. "Yes, but stay in the yard," Hazel cautioned, "and listen for your father's horse." As Thomas darted outside, Hazel moved through the cabin with Margaret on her hip, reacquainting herself with the home she'd missed so desperately. In the bedroom, she found evidence of Finn's loneliness: her nightgown laid out on her pillow as if in hopeful anticipation, one of her handkerchiefs on his bedside table where he might have held it in the night. The simple signs of his longing moved her profoundly. This strong, capable man who had carved a life from wilderness had missed her with an intensity that matched her own yearning for him. From outside came the sound of hoofbeats approaching at a steady pace. Hazel's heart leaped, and she moved quickly to the front door, stepping onto the porch just as Finn rode into the yard. He saw Thomas, first the boy, racing toward him with unbridled excitement, and for a moment, Finn seemed frozen in disbelief, as if afraid he was imagining his son's presence. Then his gaze lifted to the porch, where Hazel stood with Margaret, and his face transformed with such naked joy that tears sprang to her eyes. In one fluid motion, Finn dismounted and caught Thomas in a bear hug, lifting the boy high before setting him down with a quick ruffle of his hair. Then he was striding toward the porch, his eyes never leaving Hazel's face, his expression a mixture of delight and disbelief. "You're early," he said when he reached her, his voice husky with emotion. "I couldn't stay away any longer," Hazel replied simply, shifting Margaret so he could see the baby's face. "We missed you too much." Finn reached out to touch his daughter's cheek reverently, then drew both of them into a careful embrace that quickly included Thomas as he scrambled up the porch steps to join them. For several moments, they stood locked together, a family reunited, while the sun slipped below the mountains and the first stars appeared in the deepening blue above. Later, after the children were fed and bathed and tucked into beds they'd clearly missed, Finn and Hazel sat together on the porch swing he'd built during her absence. His arm encircled her shoulders, and her head rested against him, their bodies reconnecting with the easy familiarity of long marriage. "Cincinnati is unchanged?" he asked, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her arm. "The city has grown, but its essence remains the same," Hazel replied. "Aunt Alina sends her regards and thanks for the maple sugar. She says it's far superior to what they sell in the shops there." Finn nodded, though she sensed his question had deeper implications. "And how did it feel, being back in civilization?" Hazel lifted her head to look at him directly, needing him to see the truth in her eyes. "It felt like visiting a foreign country where I once knew the language but have since forgotten the customs. Everything was familiar yet strange, comfortable yet constraining." Relief flickered across his features, though he tried to hide it. "I worried," he admitted quietly, "that once you were back among the comforts and culture you grew up with, this life might seem too harsh by comparison." "Oh, Finn." Hazel reached up to touch his face, tracing the lines that worry and waiting had deepened around his eyes. This life is not without hardship, it's true, but it's also filled with meaning and purpose and a freedom I never knew in Cincinnati. His hand covered hers, pressing it more firmly against his cheek. And us. Did you think about what life might be if you'd married someone there instead of a Montana rancher? The vulnerability in the question pierced Hazel's heart. This proud, strong man had spent weeks wondering if she might choose a different path, a different partner, now that she'd been reminded of the alternatives. "There is no life for me without you," she said fiercely. "No city comforts or social advantages could possibly compensate for the absence of your love, your partnership, your understanding of who I truly am." Something tight in Finn's expression relaxed at her words, and he bent to kiss her with a tenderness that quickly deepened into hunger. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "Welcome home, Hazel Cooper," he whispered, "now and always." As night settled fully over Cooper's Creek, wrapping the homestead in velvet darkness pierced by stars brighter than any city lights, Hazel knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice not just in returning, but in every decision that had led her from Cincinnati to this man and this life they'd built together. Here, in the shadow of mountains that had witnessed their meeting, their struggles, their deepest joys and fears, was where she belonged. Not because fate or circumstance had brought her here, but because she had chosen it, again and again, with clear eyes and full heart. Dawn would find her still here, on the porch of the home she loved, beside the man who had waited for her return with unwavering faith in their shared future, a future they would continue to build together in this wild, beautiful land they both claimed as their own.